The wind was the first thing you knew of Montana. It was a constant, a preacher and a thief. It sermonized over the barren plains, whispering through the sparse, frost-bitten grass. And it stole the warmth from your bones, the hope from your heart. On nights like this, in the deep gut of a late 1870s winter, it was not a whisper, but a howl, a blade of pure cold that searched out every crack in the Callahan's small timber cabin. Inside, Rose Callahan, 19 years of age, pushed a needle through the thick wool of her father's worn coat. The thread was coarse. The light from the single oil lamp was a weak, sputtering yellow, and her fingers were stiff. Each stitch was a small act of defiance against the decay that seemed to press in from all sides. The past year had stripped them bare. The fever had taken their small herd of cattle down to a handful of bony survivors. And a summer fire, born of a lightning strike on the parched land, had consumed their best grazing pasture, turning it to a field of black stubble. The lamp on the rough-hewn table flickered, its flame dancing in the drafts that snaked through the walls. It cast long, wavering shadows that made the small room seem vast and haunted. Her father, Patrick Callahan, sat across from her, his hands wrapped around a tin cup of weak chicory coffee. He was not an old man, but the land and its hardships had weathered him, carving deep lines into his face and stealing the light from his eyes. He stared into his cup as if searching for an answer in its dark reflection. But Rose knew he would find nothing there. He had always been a gentleman, full of love for his daughter, but lacking the hard core of defiance the territory demanded of its inhabitants. Violence, whether from the sky or from a man, left him flinching and broken. Rose finished her stitch and knotted the thread. It will hold for a while longer. Pa. Patrick looked up, his gaze distant. "It is a good coat," he said the words, but they held no weight. His mind was elsewhere, lost in a ledger of debts and sorrows. He was a man drowning in silence. Rose felt the familiar pang of guilt. She was strong, stronger than he was in many ways, but she did not know how to fight this enemy. You could not mend a broken spirit with a needle and thread. Her immediate goal was simple, desperate to keep this roof, however flimsy, over their heads, to keep their name, their dignity, from being ground into the dust like so many others. She knew who held the deed to their land now. They all did. Silas Reeve. His name was a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. He was the shadow that fell over this entire valley. A man who collected misfortunes like a miser collecting coins. He owned the general store, held the note on the saloon, and possessed the paper on nearly every small farm and ranch for 100 miles. He was as cold and relentless as the winter itself. The only man whose shadow was longer than Reeves was Nathaniel Whitmore. Whitmore was a different kind of power. His ranch was vast, his wealth old and solid, built on good land and better cattle. He was a widower, a man who kept to himself, wrapped in a grief that had become the stuff of local legend. People said he was a just man, but a remote one. He was the only person in the territory that Silas Reeve treated with a measure of caution. A mountain, immovable and silent, that the wind of Reeve's ambition had to blow around. A sound cut through the howl of the wind, a rhythmic, metallic clatter. Hoofbeats. Rose's hand stilled over the coat. Patrick's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a fear that was sharp and immediate. No one rode out on a night like this without a dire purpose. The sound grew closer, steady, unhurried. The clatter of hooves on frozen ground was the sound of fate arriving. Rose stood, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "I will see who it is." "No." Patrick's voice was a ragged whisper. "Stay, he will see you soon enough." There was no need to ask who. The heavy footsteps on the porch confirmed it. A sharp, commanding knock rattled the door in its frame. It was not the knock of a neighbor seeking shelter. It was the knock of a man who knew he owned the door, the frame, and everything behind it. Patrick rose slowly, his chair scraping against the floorboards. His shoulders were slumped, the posture of a man already defeated. He fumbled with the latch and pulled the door inward. Silas Reeve filled the doorway, a human silhouette against the swirling snow. He was a tall man, lean and hard as cured leather. A long coat fell to his boots, and his face, framed by a dark hat, was all sharp angles and shadows. The cold seemed to emanate from him, an aura that pushed the cabin's meager warmth back. Callahan. Reeve's voice was low and smooth, with an edge like splintered ice. He did not ask to come in. He simply stepped past Patrick, bringing the frigid night in with him. His eyes swept the cabin, taking in the sparse furniture, the mended coat, the single lamp. It was the look of a man appraising property, not a home. His gaze finally settled on Rose. It lingered, cold and possessive, and a shudder went through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "Reeve," Patrick said, closing the door. "It is a hard night for a ride. The debt is a hard thing." "Too," Reeve replied, his eyes still on Rose. "It does not care about the weather. The note is past due. You know this." "The fire, the cattle," Patrick began, his voice trailing off. They were the same excuses he had given last month. They were the truth, but they sounded hollow, weak. Reeve made a dismissive gesture. "Every man in this valley has a story. I am not a collector of stories. Callahan, I am a collector of debts. I own this land. The paper says so." He took a step closer to the table, his presence shrinking the room, and everything on it. Again, his eyes found Rose. He smiled, a thin, cruel curving of his lips. "Of course, there are other ways to settle a debt. A man in my position has needs. A big house can feel empty. A pretty girl like your daughter. She could work to pay what is owed. In my house." The implication hung in the air, thick and foul. It was a threat more chilling than the wind, a violation that went deeper than the seizure of land. Rose felt a flush of hot anger rise in her chest, but it was trapped beneath a layer of cold fear. She saw her father's face, pale and stricken. She saw his hands clench and unclench at his sides. He loved her, she never doubted that. But he was a man cornered, a rabbit facing a wolf. "She is not part of this," Patrick said, his voice barely audible. Reeve laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "She became part of it the moment you signed your name. You bet the farm, and you bet her future along with it. Tonight, I collect." He looked from Patrick's desperate face to Rose's defiant one. "I will be back in 1 hour. Pack what you can carry. The house becomes mine. As for the girl," he let the sentence hang, then turned toward the door. "You will decide what she is to do." He was gone as quickly as he arrived, leaving the door open to the howling wind and the suffocating silence of despair. Patrick staggered to the door and shut it, leaning his forehead against the rough wood. The oil lamp on the table swayed violently in the residual draft, its light lurching across the walls, a perfect reflection of the chaos in his own soul. Rose went to him, her anger for Reeve eclipsed by a wave of pity for her father. "Pa, we will not let this happen." He turned, and the look on his face broke her heart. It was a mask of utter hopelessness. "How—" "Rose, how do we fight him? He holds all the cards. He is the law here." "There has to be a way," she insisted, though she could not imagine what it might be. Her mind raced. They could run. But where? Into the teeth of a blizzard with no money, no food. It was a slower death, but just as certain. Patrick walked back to the table and sank into his chair, his head in his hands. He was muttering, his words lost in the sound of the wind. He was broken. And Rose, for the first time, felt the icy grip of true helplessness. She had always believed in her own resilience, in their ability to endure, but this was different. This was not a hardship of the land. It was the calculated cruelty of a man. For a long time, the only sounds were the wind and Patrick's quiet, agonized breathing. Rose felt as if the walls were closing in, the air growing thin. She began to pack a small satchel, A purely mechanical act, a change of clothes, her mother's silver locket, the sewing kit. What did you pack for the end of your world? Then, Patrick lifted his head. There was a new light in his eyes, a flicker of something she could not read. It was not hope. It was something harder, more terrible. It was the light of a man who has chosen the last, unthinkable option. There is one way, he said, his voice strangely steady. One man Reeve will not cross. Rose stopped packing. Who? Nathaniel Whitmore. The name fell into the room with immense weight. Whitmore, Pa. What are you talking about? We barely know him. He would not help us. He will, Patrick said, a grim certainty in his tone. He stood and began to pace, the floorboards groaning under his feet. I went to see him last week. I did not tell you. I offered him a deal. A cold dread washed over Rose. What deal? Patrick would not meet her eyes. He stared at the flickering lamp, his conscience swaying with the flame. Reeve wants this land, but Whitmore wants stability. He does not like Reeve stirring up trouble, burning men out. It is bad for the territory, bad for his business. He paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath. Whitmore. He lost his wife some years ago. His house is as empty as Reeve's, but his heart is emptier. He needs a wife. Rose felt the blood drain from her face. The satchel fell from her numb fingers. No, Pa, you cannot mean it. He is a good man. Rose, Patrick pleaded, finally looking at her. Tears welled in his eyes. He is not like Reeve. He is respected, honorable. He gave his word. He would keep you safe. He would protect you. He would protect me. Protect me! Her voice was a strained whisper. By selling me, by trading me like livestock, is that what you call protection? The accusation hung between them, sharp and painful. It is not a sale, he cried, his voice cracking. It is a marriage to save you from a monster. I send you to a good man, is that so wrong? He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A deed. He has already paid the debt. Reeve cannot touch us. He bought the note from him, and... Patrick's voice dropped, full of a strange mix of shame and pride. And he gave me a horse, a fine white mare. For you, a wedding gift. The words hit her like a physical blow. A horse, a beautiful white horse, was the price of her life, her freedom, her choice, her father. The man who loved her had made a bargain for her very soul without her consent. He had looked at the two evils, the wolf and the gilded cage, and chosen the cage for her. He saw it as salvation. She saw it as a different kind of ruin. The hoofbeats were returning. Reeve was coming back. Patrick grabbed her arms, his grip desperate. Rose, please, forgive me. It is the only way. Say yes. Marry Nathaniel Whitmore. You will be safe. You will be warm. You will never know this kind of fear again. Outside, the wind howled, and the hooves of Silas Reeve's horse clattered on the frozen earth. A merciless clock ticking down the final seconds of her old life. Her father's desperate face, the image of the cold, predatory smile of Silas Reeve, and the thought of a silent, grieving stranger in a large, empty house all swirled in her mind. Patrick had not given her a choice. He had given her an exchange, her life for his peace of mind, her freedom for the deed to a patch of worthless land and a fine white horse. It was a bitter, impossible calculus, and a new destiny was waiting for her on the other side of the door. The wedding, if one could call it that, took place in the town's small, leaning chapel. There were no bells. The wind provided the only hymn, a mournful song that pushed against the thin walls and rattled the single window in its frame. There were no guests. Rose's father stood beside her, his face a gray mask of shame and relief. He would not look at her, focusing instead on the worn floorboards as if they held the scripture for this strange, hurried sacrament. Nathaniel Whitmore stood on her other side, a figure carved from the very silence of the plains. He was taller than she had imagined, with broad shoulders that spoke of a life of physical labor. Despite his wealth, his face was weathered, his eyes the color of a winter sky, holding a deep, quiet sorrow that seemed to absorb the light. He wore a clean but plain coat, and his hands, resting at his sides, were large and capable. He did not look at her either, not at first. He faced the weary circuit preacher, a man who smelled of dust and horses and seemed eager to be done with the business. Rose felt nothing. It was a strange, hollow sort of peace. The terror of Silas Reeve had receded, replaced by a vast, empty numbness. She had agreed, in the face of her father's utter collapse. In the final seconds before Reeve's knock came again, she had nodded her head once, a single, jerky motion that had sealed her fate. The words of the ceremony washed over her, a meaningless river of sound. She was an observer at her own life, a ghost in the room. When it came time for the vows, the preacher cleared his throat. "Do you, Rose Callahan, take this man?" She felt Nathaniel's gaze on her then. For the first time, it was not possessive, not demanding. It was steady and heavy with an unspoken understanding. She found her voice, a small, thin thing. "I do." When the question was put to him, his answer was firm, a low rumble that seemed to settle the dust in the air. "I do." There was no ring. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, closed his book with a snap, and accepted a coin from Nathaniel with a grateful nod before disappearing out the back, eager to get to the saloon before the snow got any deeper. Patrick finally turned to his daughter. "Rose," he began, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Be well." He could not say more. He gave her a clumsy, fleeting embrace, and then he, too, was gone, leaving her alone with her husband. The silence in the chapel was absolute now, more profound than the wind outside. Rose stood frozen, her hands clasped in front of her. This was it. The transaction was complete. Nathaniel moved, not toward her, but to retrieve her small satchel from a nearby pew. When he turned back, his expression was serious, his gaze direct. "Miss Callahan," he began, his voice softer now that they were alone. Then he corrected himself. "Rose, I know this is not a union of your choosing. I know the circumstances. I want you to understand something." He took a half-step closer, and she braced herself, a knot of old fear tightening in her stomach. But he stopped, keeping a respectful distance between them. "I will not touch you if you do not want me to," he said quietly. The words were simple, stark against the backdrop of the crude chapel and the violent bargain that had brought them there. "Your father sought my protection for you, and you will have it. Your room will be your own. This will be your home, not your prison. I give you my word." The promise was so unexpected it pierced through her numbness. It was a small mercy, but in her desolate world, it felt as vast as the sky. She could only nod, unable to speak past the lump that had formed in her throat. He seemed to understand, giving a slight, formal dip of his head before saying, "We should go. The storm is getting worse." The journey to the Whitmore Ranch was made in a sturdy wagon, the canvas cover snapping in the wind. The white mare her father had spoken of was tied to the back, a ghostly shape in the falling snow. The landscape was a blur of gray and white, an endless expanse of rolling plains that seemed to swallow them whole. It was a beautiful country, in a stark and unforgiving way. Golden grass, cured by the frost, poked through the thin layer of snow under a heavy, oppressive sky. It was a land of both beauty and threat, and she felt a kinship with it. The ranch appeared out of the swirling snow like a fortress. A long, impressive house made of massive logs sat at the center, smoke curling from 2 stone chimneys. It was flanked by a huge, sturdy barn, a blacksmith shop, and several smaller outbuildings, all built to withstand the worst the territory could throw at them. A team of ranch hands, weathered men with watchful eyes, appeared to take the wagon and horses, their movements efficient and silent. They glanced at Rose, their faces betraying a flicker of curiosity, but they said nothing, their loyalty to their employer absolute. As Nathaniel led her toward the house, the front door opened. A woman stood there, wiping her hands on an apron. She was stout, with a kind, round face and hair the color of corn silk, streaked with gray. Her smile was a small beacon of warmth in the cold afternoon. "Mr. Whitmore, you made it back safe," she said, her voice warm and melodic. "Get inside, both of you, before you freeze solid." "Talia, this is Rose," Nathaniel said, his tone formal. "My wife." Talia Monroe's eyes, a bright, intelligent blue, met Rose's. There was no judgment in them, only a deep, womanly sympathy. She took Rose's satchel and her coat. "Welcome to the ranch. Rose, come to the fire. You look like a lost lamb." The inside of the house was as imposing as the outside. A great room with a high, beamed ceiling was dominated by a massive stone fireplace where a whole log was blazing. The furniture was dark, heavy wood, built for comfort and longevity. It was a man's house, solid and somber, but Talia's presence softened it, with woven blankets draped over chairs and the smell of baking bread coming from a distant kitchen. Rose stood awkwardly by the hearth, soaking in the heat. She felt like an imposter, a piece of furniture that did not belong. This was another woman's home. She could feel the ghost of her, the memory of her, in the arrangement of the room, in the quiet sorrow that clung to her new husband. In the tack room she had glimpsed on their way in. She had seen it a fine side saddle, its leather tooled with flowers, hanging empty and unused on a rack, a shadow from the past she was now expected to step into. Talia returned with a steaming mug. "Drink this. It is just broth, but it will put some life back in you." Rose took it, her cold fingers wrapping around the warm ceramic. "Thank you." "Of course, child." Talia looked down at Rose's feet. She was wearing the best pair of boots she owned, sturdy enough for farm work but polished and cared for. They were now scuffed from the journey but still looked painfully new against the worn floorboards. Talia's lips twitched into a small smile. "Those are fine boots." Rose looked down, embarrassed. "They are all I have." "Oh, they will do for now," Talia said, a gentle humor in her voice. "But you should know, the dirt here does not take a shine to shiny things. It prefers to make friends with your knees." The simple, earthy joke was another small crack in Rose's icy composure. A genuine, if fleeting, smile touched her own lips. This woman, she thought, might be a friend. Talia was a bridge to this new life, a handhold in a sea of uncertainty. Later, Talia showed her to her room upstairs. It was a simple, clean space with a large bed, a wardrobe, and a window that looked out over the endless snow-covered plains. It was far grander than anything she had ever known, but it felt cold, impersonal, a golden prison. The thought returned, sharp and unwelcome. She was safe from Silas Reeve, but she was trapped nonetheless, trapped by a debt she had not incurred, by a bargain she had not made. A wave of guilt washed over her, guilt for her father, for the shame he must be feeling, for the desperate act that had led them here, guilt for her own resentment. Should she not be grateful? She had a warm room, a fire, the promise of safety. Yet all she felt was a profound sense of dislocation, as if her soul had been unmoored and set adrift. Nathaniel kept his word. He did not come to her room that night. She heard his heavy footsteps pause outside her door for a moment before continuing down the hall to another room. She lay in the large, unfamiliar bed, listening to the wind howl around the corners of the big house. It sounded different here, less like a blade and more like a lonely, searching voice. She thought of her father's small, drafty cabin and ached with a homesickness so sharp it was a physical pain. She thought of Nathaniel's promise, a strange and honorable contract within the larger, colder one of their marriage. He had offered her respect, a thing she had not expected, But respect was not warmth. It was not companionship. She stared into the darkness, the shadow of the empty, flower-tooled saddle hanging in her mind. Was a marriage without touch, without connection, just another kind of cold, another contract to be endured in the long, hard winter of her life. The house began to breathe. In the days that followed, Rose learned its rhythms, which were the rhythms of the land itself. Life at the Whitmore Ranch was a steady, demanding pulse that began long before the sun crested the eastern plains. It was the sound of boots on the floorboards in the pre-dawn chill, the smell of coffee and frying salt pork, the low murmur of men preparing for the day's work. There was always work. Fences to be mended where the weight of early snow had snapped the wire, the slow, methodical count of the cattle, moving them to sheltered gullies where they could find some protection from the biting wind. Saddles to be repaired, the thick leather needing a strong hand and a patient stitch. And always, the endless cooking. Talia presided over the kitchen like a benevolent queen, turning out huge pots of beans and bacon, stacks of sourdough bread, and rich, dark coffee. Rose, unwilling to be a silent ornament in this world of constant motion, made herself useful. She had a quick mind and deft fingers. Talia taught her how to render tallow for candles and soap, how to manage the massive larder, and how to bake cornbread in a cast-iron skillet big enough to feed a dozen hungry men. One afternoon, as she slid a golden slab of the bread onto the long trestle table in the mess hall, one of the younger ranch hands, a boy named Samuel with a dusting of freckles, grinned at her. He told her in this place, cornmeal was the second currency, right after cattle. It was a small joke, a simple acknowledgement of her contribution, but it warmed her more than the kitchen stove. She was beginning to find a small patch of ground to stand on. The first big snowstorm of the season arrived without fanfare. A quiet thickening of the gray sky that soon became a blinding curtain of white. For 3 days, they were sealed inside the ranch house. The world beyond the windows erased. The wind howled a familiar, mournful song. But here, inside the thick log walls, it was a distant threat, not an immediate one. The house felt safe, a ship riding out a storm at sea. During those days, the men worked in the barn, braiding rawhide into ropes and mending harnesses. Rose sat with Talia by the fire in the great room, mending clothes, her needle moving with a steady, comforting rhythm. She watched Nathaniel. He was a quiet presence, never idle. He spent hours in his study, a room she had only glimpsed, filled with books and ledgers. When he was with his men, he worked alongside them, his movements economical and sure. He spoke little, but when he did, they listened. She saw him one morning in the barn, calming a spooked horse with a low voice and a steady hand on its neck. There was a gentleness in his touch, a deep, abiding respect for the animal that seemed at odds with the harsh, silent exterior he presented to the world. She was beginning to see that the man was like his house, formidable and solid on the outside, but with a steady, life-giving warmth at its core. An ice flow, she thought, with a warm current running deep beneath. It was during the tail end of the storm that she made the discovery. Talia had asked her to fetch a fresh ledger from Nathaniel's study, as she needed to tally the week's supplies. The study was his sanctuary, and Rose entered it with a feeling of trepidation. It was a simple, masculine room, dominated by a large desk of dark oak. Books on animal husbandry and engineering lined one wall. It was meticulously tidy, except for a stack of papers on the corner of the desk, held down by a piece of raw quartz. As she reached for the new ledger on a nearby shelf, her sleeve brushed the stack, and the papers slid. Fanning out across the desk, she moved to straighten them, a flush of embarrassment warming her cheeks. And then she saw them. They were deeds of land, promissory notes, contracts. She recognized the names. Miller, Jensen, Abernathy, families from down the valley, small ranchers like her father had been. And on each one, Scrawled across the dense legal text in bold, black ink was the same name, Silas Reeve. But it was what was stamped over his name that made her breath catch in her throat. In stark, crimson red. 2 words were stamped on every single document. Paid in full. There were dozens of them. A thick sheaf of financial chains, all broken. She sank into the leather chair behind the desk, her legs suddenly weak. This was what he did with his time, with his money. He was fighting a silent war, not with guns, but with gold. He was buying the freedom of the entire valley, one family at a time, and telling no one. The weight of his secret settled upon her, immense and profound. It was a justice delivered in the quiet of a study, not in the public square. That evening, after the simple meal was done and Talia had retired to her quarters, Rose found Nathaniel by the fire in the great room. He was staring into the flames, a book resting unread in his lap, his face etched with a familiar, weary sorrow. She held one of the deeds in her hand, the paper trembling slightly. She had to speak. She could not let this silent act of grace go unacknowledged. She said she had found them. She told him she understood what he was doing. He looked up, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. He did not seem surprised, only tired. He confirmed it with a simple nod. Rose's heart was pounding. This was a weapon, a powerful one. She told him they had to tell people. They needed to know they were not alone. If the families knew their debts were gone, that they were free from Reeve's grasp, they would find their courage. They could stand together. Silas Reeve thrived on fear and isolation. This knowledge would shatter both. Nathaniel's face hardened. He told her no. The word was flat, final. But why? She pressed, her voice rising with a passion she did not know she possessed. These people deserve to know. They deserve to feel safe. This secret helps no one but Silas. He stood then, his tall frame casting a long, dancing shadow on the wall. He looked down at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something raw and painful in his winter sky eyes. He told her that he did not need their gratitude. He needed Reeve to stop burning down barns. The words chilled her. He had seen this before. He knew what Reeve was capable of when his authority was challenged openly. He explained that if the valley knew he was their silent benefactor, Reeve would see it as a declaration of war. He would not come for Nathaniel directly. He was too cunning for that. He would retaliate against the weakest. He would make examples of them. More fires, more ruined lives. Nathaniel's quiet war was one of attrition, designed to starve the wolf, not provoke it into a frenzy. Public knowledge would turn his shield into a target, and the very people he sought to protect would be caught in the crossfire. His logic was sound, born of a bitter pragmatism she could not deny. Yet it felt wrong. It felt like hiding from a fight that needed to be fought in the light. They stood there in silence, the gulf between his caution and her burgeoning defiance wide and deep. He was a man trying to contain a fire. She was a woman who wanted to shout for help. A few days later, after the last of the snow had melted into the thirsty earth, he found her by the corral. She had been trying to teach herself to braid a lasso from a length of spare rope, her fingers clumsy and inept. He watched her for a moment, then walked over, took the rope from her hands, and with a few swift, expert motions, started the braid for her, showing her how to keep the tension even. He said to her, "You cannot learn to ride if you are always on the ground." He led her into the barn. The air inside was warm and sweet with the smell of hay and horses. He walked to the far stall. Inside was the most beautiful horse she had ever seen. It was not the white mare he had given her father, but a finer animal, a palomino with a coat like spun gold and a mane and tail the color of fresh cream. The mare watched them with intelligent, gentle eyes. Nathaniel unlatched the stall door, murmuring softly to the horse. He told Rose her name was Orchid. She had belonged to his wife. The name, the history, hung in the air between them. This was not just a horse. It was a memory, a piece of his sealed-off heart. He said his wife had loved to ride. She used to say that the back of a horse was the only place a person could see over the tops of their own troubles. He thought perhaps Rose might find that to be true as well. He held out the lead rope to her. The gesture was simple, but it was laden with a meaning that resonated deep inside her. He was not just giving her a horse. He was entrusting her with a part of his past. He was offering her a key, a chance at a freedom he understood she desperately needed. It was an act of profound trust, a quiet bridge built across the chasm of their strange, cold marriage. She took the rope, her fingers brushing his. His skin was warm. It was the first time they had touched. The quiet rhythm Rose had learned to live by began to fray at the edges. News from the outside world arrived with the cold, carried by lone riders who stopped for a hot meal and a moment by the fire. The news was always the same. Fire. Another small rancher. A man who had tried to bargain with Silas Reeve, who had refused to sell his land for pennies on the dollar, had lost everything to a blaze in the dead of night. The Miller place first, then the Jensen homestead. The fires were always explained away as accidents, a stray ember from a hearth, a lantern knocked over in a barn. But everyone knew the truth. It was Reeve's signature, written in smoke and ash. With the news came the whispers. They slithered into the ranch with the subtlety of smoke under a door. The talk in town, the riders said, had turned to Nathaniel Whitmore. Why was he buying up so much debt? The story had twisted, deformed by fear and suspicion. He was not seen as a savior, but as a different kind of predator, one who used coin instead of a torch. The rumor was that he was in league with Reeve, letting the smaller man do the dirty work while Whitmore consolidated power, waiting to swallow the whole valley. The injustice of it was a bitter pill for Rose to swallow. She saw the truth every day, in the quiet lines of worry on Nathaniel's face when he thought no one was watching, in the long hours he spent locked in his study. But she held her tongue, bound by his cautious strategy. She spent her days with Orchid, the Palomino mare becoming her confidant and her escape, on the horse's back, with the wind tearing at her hair and the vast, empty plains stretching out before her. She could almost feel free, but the freedom was an illusion, a small circle of peace in a land smoldering with fear. The smell of distant smoke seemed to cling to the very air. The crisis arrived on a fiercely cold afternoon. A ranch hand, riding the southern fence line, came galloping back to the house, his horse lathered and heaving. He shouted for Nathaniel before he was even out of the saddle. Another fire, a small homestead not 5 miles from their own property line, the Callahan place. Rose's blood ran cold. The world seemed to tilt, the solid ground beneath her feet turning to treacherous ice. Nathaniel was at her side in an instant, his hand briefly touching her arm, a steadying, solid presence. He dispatched a wagon and 2 men immediately, their faces grim. There was nothing to be done for the cabin, but there was a man to be found. They brought her father back just as the sun was setting, a mercilessly beautiful spectacle of orange and purple against the snow-dusted hills. Patrick Callahan was a ruin. He was slumped in the back of the wagon, wrapped in a singed blanket, his face blackened with soot, his hands a raw, blistered mess. He was shivering uncontrollably, less from the cold and more from shock. The smell of burned wood and despair clung to him. Talia and Rose got him inside, cutting away the remnants of his scorched shirt, cleaning his wounds as best they could. He did not speak, did not seem to recognize Rose at all. His eyes were wide and vacant, staring at a horror only he could see. They put him in a guest room near the kitchen, and Talia sat with him, forcing sips of broth and whiskey between his chattering teeth. Rose stood in the doorway, watching the woman she barely knew tend to the father who had become a stranger. A storm of emotions warred within her. Pity, fierce and sharp, for the broken man in the bed, and a cold, hard anger that had been simmering for weeks and was now threatening to boil over. This was the consequence of silence. This was the price of caution. Later that night, after Talia had given him a sleeping draught and he had finally fallen into a fitful, groaning sleep. Rose went into the room. The lantern was turned down low, casting soft shadows. She sat in the chair by his bed and simply watched him breathe. In sleep, the terror had receded from his face, leaving behind the familiar lines of weariness and sorrow she knew so well. He was her father, the man who had taught her to read, who had held her hand at her mother's grave, the man who had sold her. He awoke near dawn, a low moan escaping his lips. His eyes, clearer now, found hers in the dim light. "Rose," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "I am here, Pa." Tears welled in his eyes and traced clean paths through the soot on his cheeks. He tried to sit up, wincing as the blankets pulled at his burned hands. He told her it was all gone. Everything, the cabin, the small barn, the hay they had worked so hard to put up. All of it, just a pile of black bones sticking out of the snow. She asked him why he had not left. She had sent word through a traveling tinker a week ago, telling him to take the money Nathaniel had given him and go, to get out of the valley before the fire found him too. His gaze fell to his bandaged hands. The shame was so heavy in the room it felt hard to breathe. And then the story came out, a torrent of confession, whispered in the gray light of a new day. He had not just accepted Nathaniel's offer that terrible night. The idea had been his. He had been the one to go to Nathaniel weeks before Reeve had made his final threat. He had seen the way Reeve looked at her, knew what the man wanted. In his terror, in his weakness, he had sought out the one power in the valley Reeve feared. He had gone to the widower, the lonely man in the big house, and he had made a proposal. His daughter's hand in marriage in exchange for her safety, for his own salvation. The white mare had not been a gift. It had been part of the price. The words struck Rose with the force of a physical blow. The last fragile defense she had built around her father's actions crumbled into dust. He had not been a desperate man choosing the lesser of two evils presented to him. He had been the architect of her fate. He had not been saving her from a trap. He had laid a different one himself, baited with her life. The feeling of betrayal was so profound, so absolute. It left her breathless. The gratitude she had forced herself to feel, the understanding she had struggled to maintain, all of it evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing rage. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. She could not look at him. She walked out of the room without a word, leaving him alone with his painful, liberating truth. She felt Nathaniel's presence before she saw him. He was standing in the hall, his face grim. He had heard. He did not have to say it. "Did you know?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. He nodded once. "And you agreed to it?" He looked at her then, his gaze steady, unflinching. He did not try to explain, did not offer excuses for her father or for himself. He did not try to soften the ugly truth of the transaction. All he said was, "The burden is mine now." His quiet acceptance was more disarming than any apology. He was not shifting blame. He was shouldering it, all of it, the weight of her father's fear, the cost of her own unwilling sacrifice. He was standing in the wreckage of her life and claiming it as his own. But it was too much. She turned and fled, grabbing her heaviest coat and running to the barn, to Orchid, her only solace. She rode out into the plains, pushing the mare harder than she ever had before, the icy wind a welcome punishment against her tear-streaked face. She was caught between a father she now despised and a husband she did not understand, caught between a debt of gratitude and a yearning for a freedom she had never truly had. To stay was to accept the terms of her sale. To leave was to step back into the world that held Silas Reeve and the cold, lonely struggle for survival. She rode until the horse was tired and the anger had burned itself out, leaving only a hollow ache behind. When she returned to the ranch, exhausted and numb, she knew she could not go on this way. She had to understand. She had to know the full measure of the man whose name she carried. That night, when the house was deep in slumber, She made her way to his study. The door was unlocked. A single shaft of moonlight cut across the room, illuminating the great oak desk. She went to it, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her fingers traced the outline of the desk. Searching, she found it on the side, a small, locked drawer she had not noticed before. The key, she knew instinctively, would be somewhere simple. She found it in a small wooden box that held his pens. The lock turned with a soft, metallic click. She slid the drawer open. It was full of papers, not just the deeds she had seen before, but more, so many more, and account ledgers, page after page of meticulous entries, payments to the general store on behalf of a dozen families. A note showing the seed bill for the Abernathy farm was settled, a receipt for a new plow for the Jensen boy. It was not just the land. He was keeping the entire valley afloat. He was fighting Reeve on every front, in every small transaction, bleeding him of his power slowly, methodically, secretly. At the very bottom of the drawer was a map of the territory. It was marked with dozens of small crosses, each one signifying a homestead. Some were circled in red, the ones Reeve now owned, but many more were circled in blue. These were the ones Nathaniel had saved, the ones whose deeds were in this drawer, stamped with those two beautiful, defiant words paid in full. Rose sank into his chair. The papers spread before her like a testament. The moonlight shone on the map, on the small blue circles that represented families who slept in their beds, safe and ignorant of the silent guardian who watched over them. She finally understood. This was not about pride. It was not about power or reputation. He fought this war in secret, not out of caution, but out of a deep, abiding humility. He was not fighting for thanks or glory. He was fighting for the soul of the valley itself. And in that quiet, moonlit moment, Rose Callahan Whitmore knew she could no longer stand on the sidelines. The discovery in the study changed everything. The knowledge of Nathaniel's silent war did not bring Rose peace. It lit a fire in her. She saw the map in her mind, the small blue circles of salvation, and understood that it was not enough. A secret defense could be picked apart in the dark, one family at a time. The valley needed more than a hidden guardian. It needed to find its own voice. She found him the next morning in the barn, inspecting a saddle that one of the hands had just restitched. The air was crisp and smelled of leather and horse. He looked up as she approached, his eyes questioning. She carried no ledger, no request from Talia. She carried only a new, unshakable resolve. She told him his plan was noble, but it was flawed. He was saving their land, but not their spirit. A man who lives in fear, she argued, is not truly free, even if he holds the deed to his own property. Every family he saved in secret was another family left isolated, still looking over their shoulder for Silas Reeve's shadow. He listened, his hands stilling on the leather. His expression was guarded, his silence a familiar wall. She took a breath, her voice low but steady. She said, "You cannot fight a shadow by yourself. It just moves to the other side of the room. You need to light a lamp so everyone can see." She told him what he was doing was a great kindness, but the time for kindness alone was over. Now was the time for courage. His gaze was intense. He told her again of the risks, of the fires, of the certainty that Reeve would retaliate against the innocent. She met his gaze without flinching. She said she knew. She had seen the cost firsthand, smelled it on her father's burned clothes. But what was the alternative to live here, safe behind his walls, while the rest of the valley was picked off one by one to let the rumors fester, to let them believe he was a villain? She told him, "You have been walking this path alone for too long. It is time we walked it together, in two pairs of shoes, not just one." The metaphor, simple and direct, seemed to breach his defenses. He looked at his own large, worn boots, then at her smaller, scuffed ones. He saw not a man protecting a woman, but two people standing on the same treacherous ground. He was weary of the solitary burden, of the lonely weight of his secrets. He saw in her eyes not recklessness, but a fierce, clear-sighted strength that mirrored a part of himself he had long kept buried. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. They would ride to town tomorrow. The town was little more than a single dusty street, a collection of weary, wooden buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the vast, indifferent plains. The town square was not a square at all, but a wide, barren patch of red dirt in front of the post office and general store. People moved with their eyes downcast, their greetings muted. Fear was the town's most plentiful commodity. Nathaniel reined in his horse, and Rose drew Orchid up beside him. They dismounted. Their arrival together, a deliberate and united front, drew silent, curious stares. Nathaniel Whitmore rarely came to town, and never with the young wife he had acquired so suddenly. People began to drift from the store, from the saloon, from the blacksmith's shop. Drawn by a sense of occasion they could not name, they formed a loose, hesitant circle, keeping their distance. It was Rose who spoke first. Her voice, clear and surprisingly strong in the cold air, carried across the square. She did not raise it to a shout, but pitched it to be heard. A woman's voice in a place accustomed to the low rumble of men. She spoke of the land, of the hard work and the thin rewards. She spoke of the fires in the night, of neighbors losing everything they had built. She spoke of the fear, the kind of fear that makes a man bite his tongue when he should speak, that makes a community of strangers instead of friends. She did not name Nathaniel as their benefactor. She did not have to. She simply stood beside him, a testament to a different kind of power than the one they were used to. Then she looked out at their faces, at the guarded eyes and tense shoulders. She invited them to speak, to tell their stories, to be a witness for their neighbors, to let the truth be heard in the light of day. A heavy silence followed. It stretched for a long, painful minute. Men shuffled their feet in the dust. A baby cried from a nearby wagon. It seemed her appeal had failed, that the fear was too deep. From the long porch of the saloon, she saw him, Silas Reeve. He was leaning against a post, arms crossed over his chest, a thin, knowing smile playing on his lips. He was watching this small drama with the detached interest of a man watching a doomed moth flutter against a window pane. Then a voice cracked the silence. It was thin, reedy, and trembling with age. He took my well. All heads turned. It was old John Abernathy, a man whose face was a roadmap of 80 hard years. He took a shuffling step forward, his knuckles white where he gripped his hat. "My deed was clear," he said, his voice gaining a little strength, but he claimed a debt my father owed, said the interest had grown. He took my water. A man cannot ranch without water. Another voice joined in. A woman this time, Mary Miller. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes hollow. "Our barn did not catch fire by accident. I found a half-burnt rag soaked in oil near the back wall the next morning." Suddenly, the dam of fear broke. A young man spoke of his father's signature being forged on a contract. The blacksmith told of Reeves' men threatening him for refusing to shoe their horses on credit. Story after story tumbled out, a litany of petty cruelties and grand thefts, of intimidation and violence. The hesitant circle tightened, the townspeople moving closer together, their shared grievances forging a bond stronger than their individual fears. The square was no longer just a patch of dirt. It had become a courtroom, a church, a place of public conscience. The people were not just whispering anymore. They were testifying. Through it all, Silas Reeve did not move. His smile never wavered. He watched them, his eyes cold and assessing. He was not witnessing an uprising. He was taking inventory of his enemies. He pushed himself off the post, gave a mock salute in their direction, and disappeared back into the shadows of the saloon. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but the silence was different. It was not the silence of distance, but of shared experience. The sun was low, painting the western sky in brilliant, fleeting colors. The air was cold, but Rose felt a warmth spreading through her chest. a feeling so unfamiliar it took her a moment to name it. It was hope. Nathaniel rode beside her, his face thoughtful. As they crested a small rise that overlooked the vast expanse of his land, he finally spoke. He asked her why. Why had she been willing to put herself in such danger? To make herself a target for a man like Reeve? Rose looked out at the rolling plains, the golden grass glowing in the last light of the day. She thought of her father's burned-out cabin, of the terror in his eyes, of the secrets in Nathaniel's study, and the web of fear and courage that connected them all. She answered him simply, "Because no matter how well you hide, you can never escape the darkness. You have to stand up and light a candle." They stopped their horses. He turned in his saddle to face her, and in the fading light, she saw the walls around his heart begin to crumble. He saw not just the girl his bargain had bought, but the woman who had stood beside him and given a voice to his silent war. That night, she could not sleep. The events of the day replayed in her mind, a jumble of fearful faces and courageous words. She left her room and walked outside. The sky was a vast sweep of black velvet, punctured by the brilliant, cold light of 1,000 stars. The air was so still she could hear the faint sound of the cattle shifting in a distant pasture. She heard a footstep behind her and turned to see Nathaniel. He had followed her out, a blanket draped over his arm. He came to stand beside her, and for a long time, they just looked at the sky, two small figures in a vast and silent world. He gently draped the blanket around her shoulders. His fingers brushed her neck, a brief, warm touch that sent a shiver through her. He did not pull away. He turned her to face him, his hands moving to rest on her arms. In the starlight, she could see the question in his eyes, a vulnerability she had never seen before. This was not about the ranch, or the debt, or Silas Reeve. This was about them, two lonely people who had found an unexpected ally in each other. He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She tilted her face up to his. His kiss was not smooth or practiced. It was clumsy, hesitant, a question asked in the dark. It was the kiss of a man who had forgotten how, and a woman who had never known. It was chaste and deeply sincere, a simple, profound acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them. It was two people, finding their way back to warmth after a long and bitter frost. As he pulled back, a smile, a real and unguarded smile, touched his lips. In that moment, the bargain was forgotten. The contract was void. There was only the beginning of something new. But they were not alone. From the deep shadows of a stand of cottonwood trees near the barn, a figure detached itself from the darkness. One of Reeve's men had been watching their every move. He turned and slipped away, a silent messenger carrying news of this new alliance back to his master. The private moment of hope was over. The darkness they had challenged in the town square had followed them home. The kiss under the stars was a fragile beginning, a single candle lit in a vast, dark room. In the days that followed, a quiet, unspoken tenderness grew between them. There were no more grand declarations, only small, significant moments. The way he would look for her when he came in from the cold, a silent question in his eyes. The way she would make sure his coffee was hot, a simple act of care that felt more intimate than any touch. He began to talk to her of the ranch, not just as its master, but as a man sharing his burdens, his hopes for a good calf crop, his worries about a coming storm. She was no longer just an inhabitant of his house. She was becoming a part of its heart. The shadow of the bargain that had brought her there was receding, replaced by the tentative light of something real and chosen. The light was shattered by a folded piece of cheap paper. It was not delivered by any rider. Rose found it herself, tucked under the throat latch of Orchid's bridle when she went to the barn for her morning ride. Her fingers, numb from the cold, fumbled with the note. It was anonymous. The letters formed in a crude, blocky script. The words were few, but they were as sharp and deadly as shards of ice. An old man forgets how easily bones can break. A pile of ash is a cold bed. Keep your mouth shut if you want him to see the spring. The note was not signed by Silas Reeve, but it was written in his ink of terror. Rose's blood ran cold, the familiar, sickening dread coiling in her stomach. This was her fault. Her speech in the town square, her defiant stand beside Nathaniel, had painted a target on her father's back. Patrick was still weak, recovering slowly in the warmth and safety of the ranch. He was a helpless pawn in a game she had started. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. She had been so proud of her courage. But what good was courage if it brought ruin to the very person she sought to protect? Her decision was immediate, a cold, hard certainty that settled over her panic. She could not ask Nathaniel to fight this battle. It was not his. This was a threat against her blood, her past. She had to remove the target. She had to get her father away, to disappear from the valley and from Silas Reeve's memory. The thought of leaving Nathaniel, of extinguishing the small candle of their new beginning, was a pain so sharp it almost brought her to her knees. But the image of her father's burned hands, of his empty, staring eyes, was sharper still. She spent the day in a haze of quiet preparation, her movements a careful lie. She helped Talia in the kitchen, her conversation normal, her hands steady as she kneaded dough. She sat with her father for an hour, reading to him from a worn newspaper, her voice calm while a storm raged inside her. He was getting stronger, a little color returning to his cheeks. He was still lost in his shame, but he was alive, and she would do anything to keep him that way. That night, she waited until the house was still, until the only sounds were the groaning of the logs in the great room fireplace and the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. She dressed in her warmest clothes, pulling on the sturdy boots Talia had found for her, in a small satchel. She packed what little she had, along with a pouch of coins Nathaniel had insisted she keep for her own use. She crept to her father's room and watched him sleep for a moment, his breathing peaceful. She would wake him when she had the horses ready. They would slip out, take the Old North Trail, and be miles away by dawn. She would leave a note for Nathaniel, a few simple words of thanks and regret. It was a coward's farewell, but it was the only one she could manage. The porch was bathed in the cold, white light of a full moon. The air was bitingly cold, and the wooden planks groaned under her feet. She pulled her thick wool coat tighter around her breath pluming in the frigid air. The ranch was silent, a fortress asleep. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the final act of her escape. "You were not going to say goodbye?" The voice came from the shadows near the door. It was not an accusation, just a statement of quiet, painful fact. Nathaniel stepped into the moonlight. He was not dressed for bed. He wore his day clothes, as if he had been waiting, as if he had known. Rose's heart hammered against her ribs. She could not look at him. She stared out at the moon-blanched landscape, her throat tight. She told him it was better this way. He came to stand beside her, not too close, but near enough that she could feel the heat from his body. He asked her to tell him why. The truth felt like a betrayal of her own plan, but she owed him that much. She told him about the note, about the threat to her father. She explained that as long as she was here, at his side, she was a liability. Silas Reeve knew he could not hurt Nathaniel directly, so he would strike at what he perceived to be Nathaniel's weakness. Her father. "I will not be your Achilles' heel, Nathaniel," she finished, her voice a raw whisper. "I will not be the weapon he uses to destroy you." He was silent for a long moment, the kind of deep, thoughtful silence she had come to know. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough with an emotion she could not name. "You are not the weakness, Rose," he said. "You are the reason." The simple, profound words broke through her resolve. A tear escaped and traced a hot path down her cold cheek. This was harder than she ever imagined. She had to go, now, before her courage failed her completely. She turned, taking the first step off the porch, the step that would take her away from him forever. "I have to," He moved then, a half-step, closing the distance between them. He did not grab her arm. He did not block her path. He simply reached out and placed his hand on her chest. His palm was broad and warm, and she could feel its steady, solid pressure through the thick layers of her coat and dress. It was a gesture of immense tenderness, a silent, desperate plea. It rested just over her heart, and she imagined she could feel its warmth seeping into her, a counterpoint to the frantic, panicked beating beneath. He leaned closer, his face near hers, his breath warm in the cold air. His voice was a bare whisper, meant only for her, a vow spoken in the vast, moonlit silence. "Promise you will stay." The world seemed to stop. There was only the pressure of his hand, the sound of his voice, and the wild, impossible choice before her. To run was to save her father from a threat. To stay was to save herself from a life without this man, without this feeling. She stood trembling, caught between fear and a love that had grown so silently she had not realized its strength until this very moment. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his in the moonlight. She saw the truth of his words reflected there. He was not afraid of the fight. He was only afraid of facing it alone. "I will stay," she whispered, the words tasting of both surrender and victory, but on one condition. He did not remove his hand. His eyes did not leave hers. Anything. "We do this together," she said, her voice gaining strength. "No more secrets, no more silent wars. We make a plan, a real plan, to protect my father, to protect this valley. You and me, as partners." A slow smile touched his lips, a smile that reached his eyes and lit them from within. He said, "Partners." A new sound intruded on the quiet moment. The frantic, desperate drumming of hoofbeats, coming hard and fast up the main track to the house. A lone rider, pushing his horse to its absolute limit. One of Nathaniel's men from the South Camp slid his horse to a halt in a spray of dirt and frost, his chest heaving as he fought for breath. "Mr. Whitmore," he gasped. "They are here, Reeves' men. All of them. They are taking up positions in the gullies, on the ridges. They have us boxed in, the whole valley." As he spoke, a change came over the night. The brilliant, cold moonlight began to dim, hazed over by a gathering film of clouds, a sudden gust of wind, sharper and colder than before, swirled around the porch, carrying with it the first delicate messengers of the coming storm. A single perfect snowflake landed on Rose's cheek, melting against her skin like a cold tear. Then another, and another. Nathaniel's hand tightened on her chest, a reflex of protection. He looked up at the darkening sky, then out toward the unseen enemy hiding in the folds of his land. The wind began to moan, the prelude to a full-throated howl. Nature itself was closing in, building a wall of snow and ice around them. They were trapped. The trial by fire, she realized with a shudder, was going to be a trial by the bitter, unrelenting cold. The world outside the house dissolved into a maelstrom of wind and snow. The warning from the South Camp rider had given them mere minutes, a frantic scramble in which the sprawling ranch house transformed into a besieged fort. Nathaniel moved with a cold, lethal calm, issuing short, precise commands. Windows were barricaded with heavy furniture. Every rifle and shotgun was brought to the great room, the ammunition stacked on the heavy oak table that had so recently served for peaceful meals. Rose worked alongside Talia, her earlier fear burned away by a surge of adrenaline. They ripped strips of linen for bandages, filled every available bucket with water, and carried lanterns to the upstairs windows. Her father, Patrick, his face pale but his eyes clear and resolute for the first time in months, insisted on helping. He was given the task of reloading rifles, his bandaged hands clumsy but determined. He was done running. The attack began not with a shout, but with a sudden bloom of orange light against the swirling white darkness. A torch was thrown against the barn wall. It was a feint, a move designed to draw them out, to divide their small force. Nathaniel's voice cut through the rising panic. Hold your position, Samuel. Take 2 men. Put it out if you can, but do not pursue. Everyone else, watch the house. From the upstairs window, Rose saw the flickering torches of Silas Reeves' men, ghost lights dancing in the blizzard. They were moving in, using the storm as cover, their forms appearing and disappearing in the thick, driving snow. A shot cracked, and a pane of glass in the great room exploded inwards, showering the floor with glittering shards. The siege had begun. For the next hour, the night was a cacophony of chaos. The roar of the blizzard was punctuated by the sharp report of rifles, the thud of bullets burying themselves in the thick log walls, and the angry shouts of men. Rose became a vital hub in the defense. She relayed messages from the lookouts in the upper windows down to Nathaniel, her clear voice cutting through the din. She kept track of the ammunition, ensuring the men who needed it most had it. She was calm, her mind sharp and focused. The terror locked away in a deep recess of her soul. They were outnumbered. She could see it in the way Nathaniel's jaw was set, in the grim faces of the ranch hands. For every torch they could see, there were 2 more hidden in the swirling snow. They were being slowly, methodically surrounded. The fight was valiant, but it was hopeless. It was Talia who saw them first. She was peering through a crack in a barricaded window when she let out a sharp gasp. "Nathaniel, look!" Through the blizzard, new lights were appearing. Not the wild, angry orange of Reeves' torches, but the steady, golden glow of lanterns. A dozen of them, then 2 dozen. Figures were emerging from the storm, not like attackers, but like specters rising from the frozen earth. They were on foot, armed with old hunting rifles, shotguns, and even pitchforks. It was the valley. Old Man Abernathy was in the lead, his face a mask of grim determination. The Miller boys were there, their eyes burning with the memory of their burned-out barn. Farmers, blacksmiths, ranchers, the very people Nathaniel had quietly saved, had come. Their debt was not one of coin, but of loyalty, and they had come to pay it in the heart of the storm. The arrival of the villagers threw Reeves' men into confusion. Suddenly, they were not the hunters, but the hunted, caught between the fortified house and a second, unexpected line of defense. The women of the valley moved with a fierce purpose, not hiding, but becoming part of the battle. Mary Miller and others lit their own torches, not as weapons of arson, but of distraction. Their bright, waving flames drawing fire and blinding the attackers in the disorienting snow. The older men, their hands too stiff for triggers, put old cattle calls to their lips, the long, low moans echoing from different directions, making their small force sound like an army. The tide had turned. The coordinated attack devolved into a series of chaotic skirmishes in the blinding storm. Amid the chaos, Silas Reeve made his move. While his men were engaged, he broke for the house. Using the fight as his own cover, a heavy log crashed through the great room's main window, and he climbed through the shattered frame, a long-barreled pistol in his hand. Nathaniel met him in the center of the room. The 2 men, the 2 opposing forces of the valley, finally stood face to face. The wind howled through the broken window, swirling snow across the floor. "This is my house, Whitmore!" Silas snarled, his face contorted with rage. "My valley, you should have stayed out of my way." "This land does not belong to bullies and thieves," Nathaniel said, his voice a low growl. He held a rifle, but he did not raise it. This was not a fight to be settled at a distance. Silas fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Nathaniel threw himself to the side as the bullet tore a chunk of wood from the mantelpiece. He dropped the rifle and charged, tackling Silas with the force of a bull. They crashed to the floor, a tangle of limbs and fury. The pistol skittered away across the floorboards. It was a brutal, primal fight. They rolled across the floor, their fists finding purchase, grunts of pain mixing with the howl of the wind. Rose, who had come down the stairs to deliver a message, saw the struggle and her heart leapt into her throat. The ranch hands were still engaged outside. In here, Nathaniel was alone. She looked around desperately. Her eyes fell on the heavy iron bell pull that Talia used to summon the men for meals, which connected to a large bell on the roof of the barn. An idea, sharp and clear, cut through her fear. She ran to it and pulled, again and again. The deep, resonant clang of the bell began to toll, a steady, urgent rhythm that cut through the storm. It was a signal, a call to rally. The fight in the great room reached its climax. Nathaniel, stronger and driven by a righteous fury, gained the upper hand. He slammed Silas against the wall, his hands closing around the other man's throat. Silas's face began to turn purple, his eyes bulging. Nathaniel had him. He could end it right there. All the pain, all the fear, all the suffering Silas had caused could be extinguished in a single, final act of violence. Rose saw the look in Nathaniel's eyes. It was the look of a man pushed beyond his limit, a man about to cross a line from which there was no return. She ran to him, placing her hands on his arms. They were rigid as iron. "Nathaniel, no!" she cried out, her voice clear and commanding above the storm. "Look at him. He is beaten. We need justice. We cannot become another Silas." Her words, her touch, broke the spell. He looked from Silas's terrified, gasping face to hers. He saw not the weakness Reeve had tried to exploit, but the strength that had become his anchor. He saw the truth in her words. To kill Silas now would be an act of vengeance, not of justice. It would make him a killer, no better than the man he despised. He loosened his grip, and Silas slumped to the floor, choking and gasping for air. Just then, the door burst open. The villagers and the ranch hands poured in, their faces flushed with victory. They had captured most of Reeve's men who had lost their nerve when their leader disappeared. Old man Abernathy stepped forward, no longer a shuffling, frightened victim. He pointed a trembling finger at the man on the floor. "We have proof," he declared, his voice ringing with newfound authority. He held up a crumpled piece of paper, one of Reeve's forged contracts. Mary Miller stepped up beside him, holding out a small, stoppered bottle. "This is the oil he uses, the same kind I found by my barn." Another man pushed forward, holding up a dark wool coat with a missing button. He then held up the button itself. "Found this snagged on a nail by Callahan's place the night of the fire. It matches." They had not just come to fight, they had come to bear witness. They brought the law with them, woven from their collective suffering and courage. They surrounded Silas Reeve, who looked up at them with dawning horror. His power had been built on their fear and silence. Now, their voices had risen together, and he was drowning in the sound. They bound him with a length of rope, his threats and curses lost in the wind. The storm was beginning to subside, its fury spent. When the dawn came, they would take him and his men to the district courthouse. His reign was over. In the quiet aftermath, as the adrenaline faded and the exhaustion set in, Rose found her father. He was standing by the broken window, looking out at the first pale light of dawn breaking over the snow-covered land. He turned as she approached, his eyes filled with a painful mixture of pride and regret. He reached out and took her hand, his bandaged fingers surprisingly gentle. "I was wrong. Rose," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was protecting you by making choices for you, but your strength, it is not something to be sheltered. It is something to be trusted." He squeezed her hand. "Forgive an old fool. Let me learn how to trust you again." Rose looked at her father, at the man who had traded her for his own peace of mind, and she felt no anger, only a deep, weary love. They had survived. They had all survived. Outside, the world was white, clean, and silent, waiting for a new day to begin. The blizzard broke with the dawn, leaving behind a world remade in white. The sky was a pale, clean blue, and the snow lay in deep, silent drifts. smoothing the harsh lines of the land into gentle curves. The journey to the district seat was slow and arduous. A long procession of riders and wagons breaking a new trail through the pristine snow. Silas Reeve and his captured men were bound in the back of a sturdy wagon, their sullen silence a stark contrast to the quiet camaraderie of the men who guarded them. It was not a posse of lawmen, but a delegation of citizens, a moving testament to the valley's newfound unity. The trial was a formality, yet it was also a profound ritual of healing, one by one. The people of the valley stood before the circuit judge and spoke their truth. Old man Abernathy, his voice no longer trembling, recounted the theft of his water rights. Mary Miller, her eyes clear and steady, presented the oil-soaked rag and described the night her world went up in flames. The blacksmith, the baker, Patrick Callahan himself, they all testified. They laid out the years of fear, the web of fraudulent debts and veiled threats, piece by painful piece. The forged deeds were presented as evidence. The button from the burned-out Callahan cabin was matched to the coat of one of Reeves' men. The case, built over years in secret suffering, was unassailable when brought into the light. Silas Reeves sat through it all with a look of cold disbelief. He could not comprehend it. These were simple, broken people. He had owned them. He had scattered them like dust. He never imagined that they could find the will to gather themselves back together, to become a single, solid voice that would condemn him. When the judge pronounced the sentence, a long term in the territorial prison, a collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the courtroom. It was the sound of a long winter finally breaking. They returned to the valley not just as neighbors, but as a community forged in fire and ice. The work of rebuilding began at once. The first project was the miller's barn. Men from every corner of the valley arrived with saws and hammers, their shared labor a symphony of renewal. The women brought food and coffee, turning the construction site into a boisterous celebration of resilience. Nathaniel, working alongside the others, his wealth and status forgotten in the common task, donated the lumber. Others brought what they could, a few good horses, a share of their seed grain, a promising young bull to help rebuild a herd. The bad debts held by the court were nullified, and the weight of generations of fear was lifted from the valley's shoulders. In this new atmosphere of hope, the people themselves began to change. Rose saw it everywhere. She saw it in the way people now met each other's eyes in town, in the laughter that echoed from the blacksmith's shop, in the plans being made for a spring festival. She had been a catalyst, a girl traded to ensure her own survival who had ended up helping a whole valley find its courage. But now, she felt a new responsibility. It was not enough to have survived. They had to build something better on the ashes of the old. She started with the children, seeing a young boy struggling to read a notice nailed to the post office door. She announced that she would be holding a class twice a week in the small, newly repaired chapel. At first, only a few children came, shy and wary, but soon, their mothers joined them, and then a few of the younger ranch hands. Men who had spent their lives learning the language of cattle and weather, but not the written word. The chapel, once a place of silent, hurried vows, was now filled with the sounds of learning and quiet laughter. From the classes grew a new idea, a community fund, a small pool of money and resources contributed by everyone, to help any family that fell on hard times. It was a simple, radical notion their prosperity was not a private matter, but a shared one. Rose, the girl who had once felt like a piece of property, was now a leader, a weaver of the valley's new social fabric. Nathaniel watched her, his heart filled with a quiet awe. The woman he had married out of a grim sense of duty had become the vibrant center of his world. The grief for his first wife had not vanished, but it had softened, transforming from a sharp, isolating pain into a gentle, treasured memory. He no longer felt like a ghost in his own home. He found himself smiling, a slow, unaccustomed stretching of his facial muscles. He began to share the running of the ranch with his foreman, finding more time to simply be with Rose, to listen to her ideas, to share the quiet moments of the day. He, who had been a fortress of solitude, was learning to open his doors, Patrick Callahan found his own path to redemption. He did not stay at the Whitmore Ranch. The comfort there felt unearned, a constant reminder of his weakness. Once his hands had healed, he announced he had taken a job at the new sawmill being built upriver. It was hard, honest work. Before he left, he sought out Rose. They stood by the corral, the late afternoon sun warm on their faces. He did not make grand apologies. He simply told her he was proud of the woman she had become, and that he hoped one day to be a man she could be proud of again. Rose hugged him, a simple, heartfelt embrace of forgiveness. She watched him walk away, a man no longer bent by fear, but straightened by the prospect of earning his own way. One evening, as the sun was setting and the sky was ablaze with color, Nathaniel and Rose rode out onto the plains. She was on Orchid, the Palomino mare moving with a smooth, familiar grace. They did not talk much, content in the comfortable silence that had grown between them. They stopped on a high ridge overlooking the valley. The patchwork of ranches and fields spread out below them like a promise. Nathaniel reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. His touch was warm and sure. He looked at her, his winter sky eyes filled with a deep, unwavering tenderness. He told her that what had started as a bitter contract had become the greatest blessing of his life. He wanted to make new vows to her, not before a preacher, but here, under the open sky. Rose smiled, her heart full. She squeezed his hand, her gaze meeting his. There would be no empty vows, she said softly, only the promise that each morning they would choose to start again, together. It was a promise that fit them perfectly, a practical, heartfelt pledge for a life to be built day by day, not in a single, grand moment. As they turned for home, the sound of a bell drifted up from the valley floor, the chapel bell, ringing for evening service. It was a clear, hopeful sound, a sound of community and peace. Rose looked down at the dark, loamy earth of the plains, and she could almost see them, the first tiny, impossibly green shoots of new grass pushing up through the last remnants of old ash. Justice had not come from the barrel of a gun, but from the combined strength of human voices. A week later, the post-rider brought a letter. It was addressed in a neat, feminine hand to Mrs. Rose Whitmore. Inside was a formal invitation. A group of women from across the territory were forming a society. Their aims were to establish proper schools in the frontier towns and to advocate for fair prices and land rights for small farmers. They had heard of her work in the valley. They were inviting her to their first meeting. Rose held the letter, a new horizon opening up before her. The battle for the valley was won, but she saw now that it was only one small corner of a much larger world, a world that also needed brave voices and willing hands. Her journey was not over. It was just beginning. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night. Like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.